Our gospel passage today is from the Gospel of John, chapter 9. That's another lengthy passage, verses 1 through 41. As Jesus walked along, he saw a man blind from birth. His disciples asked him, "Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind?" Jesus answered, "Neither this man nor his parents sinned. He was born blind so that God's works might be revealed in him. We must work the works of him who sent me while it is day. Night is coming when no one can work. As long as I am in the world, I am the light of the world." When he had said this, he spat on the ground and made mud with his saliva, and he spread the mud on the man's eyes, saying to him, "Go, wash in the pool of Siloam," which means sent. Then he went and washed, and he came back able to see. The neighbors and those who had seen him before as a beggar began to ask, "Is this not the man who used to sit and beg?" Some were saying, "It is he." Others were saying, "No, but it is someone like him." He kept saying, "I am the man." But they kept asking him, "Then how were your eyes opened?" He answered, "The man called Jesus made mud, spread it on my eyes, and said to me, 'Go to Siloam and wash.' Then I went and washed, and I received my sight." They said to him, "Where is he?" And he answered, "I do not know." They brought to the Pharisees the man who had formerly been blind. Now it was a Sabbath day when Jesus made the mud and opened his eyes. Then the Pharisees also began to ask him how he had received his sight. And he said to them, "He put mud on my eyes. Then I washed. Now I see." Some of the Pharisees said, "This man is not from God, for he does not observe the Sabbath." But others said, "How can a man who is a sinner perform such signs?" And they were divided. So they said again to the blind man, "What do you say about him? It was your eyes that he opened." And he answered, "He is a prophet." The Jews did not believe that he had been blind and had received his sight until they called the parents of the man who had received his sight. And they asked them, "Is this your son, who you say was born blind? How then does he now see?" His parents answered, "We know that this is our son and that he was born blind. But we do not know how it is that he now sees, nor do we know who opened his eyes. Ask him. He is of age. He will speak for himself." His parents said this because they were afraid of the Jews. For the Jews had already agreed that anyone who confessed Jesus to be the Messiah would be put out of the synagogue. Therefore, his parents said, "He is of age, ask him." So for the second time, they called the man who had been blind, and they said to him, "Give glory to God. We know that this man is a sinner." He answered, "I do not know whether he's a sinner. One thing that I do know, that though I was blind, now I see." They said to him, "What did he do to you? How did he open your eyes?" He answered, "I have told you already, and you would not listen. Why do you want to hear it again? Do you also want to become his disciples?" Then they reviled him, saying, "You are his disciples. You are his disciple, but we are disciples of Moses. We know that God has spoken to Moses. But as for this man, we do not know where he comes from." The man answered, "Here is an astonishing thing. You do not know where he comes from, and yet he opened my eyes. We know that God does not listen to sinners, but he does listen to one who worships him and obeys his will. Never since the world began has it been heard that anyone opened the eyes of a person born blind. If this man were not from God, he could do nothing." They answered him, "You were born entirely in sins, and you are trying to teach us?" And they drove him out. Jesus heard that they had driven him out, and when he found him, he said, "Do you believe in the Son of Man?" He answered, "And who is he, sir? Tell me so that I may believe in him. Jesus said to him, You have seen him, and the one speaking with you is he. He said, Lord, I believe. And he worshiped him. Jesus said, I came into this world for judgment, so that those who do not see may see, and those who do see may become blind. Some of the Pharisees near him heard this and said to him, Surely we are not blind, are we? Jesus said to them, If you were blind, you would not have sin. But now that you say, we see, your sin remains.
So there are a lot of things that I could cover in this passage. I mean, there are issues around generational sin, the sins of the parents being visited on the children, of Sabbath observance, of what is or is not allowed on the day of rest, or the cost of witness, the social price that can be required when you speak the truth. And that's just to name a few off the top of my head. But what I want to get at tonight is a less technical theme that runs through this whole passage. What does it mean to be blind? Because what we have here is a story with two very different types of blindness. There's a physical blindness, which Jesus cures. And there's a spiritual blindness that it seems he can't cure. First, we have this beggar who's been blind from birth. Now, obviously, this is a physical condition of some sort. And Jesus's disciples assume, as most people would have at the time, that this was a divine judgment. I mean, after all, if no person had done this, it must have been God's will, right? There must have been a truly terrible sin somewhere for this sort of judgment to be handed down. So where was the sin? Was this judgment for the parents' sins? Had God foreknown that this man would become a sinner and so punished him in the womb? Or was he simply born sinful in some weird, abstract sense? What had happened that God would do this to a newborn baby? But Jesus tells his disciples that no, this hadn't happened to show God's judgment at all, but rather to show God's mercy. And he heals the man. He gives sight to a man who has never known it. This isn't just restoring something that was lost. Jesus is creating this out of whole cloth. Now, one would think that people's reaction to this would be to glorify God, right? I mean, a clear miracle has been done in their midst. So who in their right mind could deny that this was of God? But here's where we run across that second type of blindness. You see, the synagogue leaders had already made up their minds about Jesus. They had decided that anyone who claimed that Jesus was the Messiah would be thrown out. So they call this man in to testify. Although, I mean, to be honest, they don't really seem to care what he has to say. I mean, they're just looking for support for what they already believe, that Jesus is a sinner and a fraud. And you know, it's a funny thing. If you start off thinking you know the answer and go looking for support, you'll end up coming to the conclusion you started with, even if you don't find the evidence you want. That is spiritual blindness. And maybe it's because that's ultimately a blindness that we choose. Jesus was either unwilling or unable to heal it. I mean, God gave human beings free will, and turns out he really meant it. He will not change our hearts or minds if we do not truly want them changed. And this particular group of Pharisees didn't have any interest in changing their minds about Jesus. They talked to the man who was healed, and they talked to his parents, and they call him in again to talk with him. And with each interaction, it becomes more and more clear that they're just looking for something to confirm their preordained conclusions. And then when they don't get it, they lash out at the man who was healed. I mean, this man makes a pretty convincing argument, right? That Jesus has God's blessing. I mean, namely, God would not be acting through Jesus in these miraculous ways unless God was pleased with him. And the Pharisees refused to even consider what the man is saying. Instead, they conclude that he must have been born sinful, that he had deserved his blindness, and they expel him from the community. Now, it is worth noting here that not all of the Pharisees agreed with what happened. They were divided in verse 16, and some of them had either apparently followed Jesus or the expelled man. Verse 40 isn't really clear which. But when Jesus talks about the spiritual blindness on display, those Pharisees who are present object. No, don't lump us in with that guy. We see clearly. I'm pretty sure that you could have heard the sound of face meeting palm all the way back in the village at this point. Jesus responds by essentially saying, look, if you would just acknowledge your blindness, it could be corrected. But you don't admit it. So it remains. You see, for all of its drawbacks, physical blindness actually has an advantage over its spiritual counterpart. It's obvious to you and everybody else. You can't fake sight, but you can fake insight. In fact, it's so easy to fake insight that we can even convince ourselves that we have it. I mean, just try that with physical blindness. It's not going to work. It can't. But we don't really have to look very far to see examples in our own lives of times when we think that we have insight, when we think we're seeing clearly. Just think back for a moment to the last heated argument that you had, whatever it was. Got something in mind? Now, without knowing anything about the conversation, I'll go ahead and lay you steep odds that everyone there thought they were seeing clearly. And I'll lay even steeper odds that nobody was. Now, the good news is that those heat of the moment blind spots are passing things, right? Usually. But when those things become entrenched, when we double and triple down on the things we're convinced of, even as evidence against it mounts, when we lash out at those whom we call on to testify, or take offense at honest answers to questions that we ourselves asked, then we are choosing blindness. And if that heat of the moment is like the darkness that accompanies blinking, intuitive, natural, and brief, then this entrenched resistance to the truth is like squeezing our eyes shut. We all blink, often, every day. But the question soon becomes, are we willing to open our eyes again afterward? Do we honestly face whatever scripture or prayer or event triggered our momentary blindness? Or do we squeeze our eyes shut and move on? The synagogue leaders from our reading weren't willing to face what they were hearing from this formerly blind man. They were not willing to consider what it would mean if Jesus really were a prophet or the Messiah, or even just a good man with God's blessing. So in the end, theirs was the deeper blindness, because the beggar could be healed of his darkness. But for those who had chosen their blindness, God would not overrule their choice.